Welcome everyone to History Gone Wilder, part of Half History Will Travel. I'm your host, the Wilder historian, Dr. Lucas Wilder, and last time I covered the Battle of Shiloh at the end of April 6th. Now I open up April 7th as the engagement continues. If you like what I do, please consider subscribing to the channel if you haven't done so already, join the Patreon page, and purchase something from one of my online stores. Every little bit helps. Thank you. On the Confederate side, the bloody day gave way to a night of restlessness. Pierre-Gustave Toutant-Beauregard moved his headquarters to the Shiloh church and summoned his commanders to that location. They congratulated him on his great victory and the conclusion of that victory the next day. Beauregard's actions demonstrated a lack of preparation. His orders to the men on the front line was to fall back a safe distance from the enemy and bivouac for the night. The cavalry were sent forward to make sure he was notified if the enemy approached. Finally, he ordered the commander at Corinth to form the stragglers into companies and regiments and send them to the battlefield. The Confederate troops, although exhausted, enjoyed themselves in the abandoned camps of the Union soldiers. A soldier from Missouri wrote, "Everything a soldier could want, to which we helped ourselves. We ate their grub and slept in their cots as quietly as if we had no enemy in 100 miles. Ammunition wasn't distributed, even though cartridge boxes were empty. No significant defenses were thrown up. The Southern Army acted as though the battle was over and victory had been secured. However, most soldiers didn't sleep as easily as the man from Missouri. Many of us could not sleep that night for talking over the happenings and incidents of the day," wrote a Tennessean. "A goodly number of our friends had been killed or wounded, and we were busy till a late hour, loading up and hunting for our missing comrades and friends who had fallen. Many said rehearsals of where this and that one had fallen. Throughout the night, the Union gunboats sent shells through the air, preventing either side from getting any sleep and adding to the anxiousness felt by soldiers of both sides. Nathan Bedford Forrest, just a colonel at this point, was patrolling the front of the Confederate line, and he spied Don Carlos Buell's Army of the Ohio crossing the Tennessee River. He even sent Confederate soldiers in blue uniforms into the Union lines to obtain more intelligence. He reported the happenings multiple times, but no one would listen, and he wasn't the only one seeing the Union forces grow throughout the night, but the warnings weren't heeded. The actions of each army on the night of April 6th would decide the next day's battle. The rain poured down upon soldiers, both blue and gray, and the thunder roared alongside the gunboats' artillery, but as dawn approached, the storm began to pass. Because of its advanced placement at the end of April 6th, Pond's brigade was still on the front lines throughout the night, because he didn't receive word to pull back, and he knew the importance of his brigade to the Confederate left flank. It would be Pond's men that came into contact with the Union juggernaut first. Pond's artillery and the Union guns dueled for an hour from 5:30 a.m. to 6:30 a.m. As they threw shot and shell at one another, Ulysses S. Grant rode over to Lew Wallace and gave him his orders for the day. Wallace would constitute the extreme right wing of the Union Army and outflank any defenders in its way. The appearance of stiff resistance by Pond's men convinced Wallace's newly arrived division to move slowly and cautiously toward the Confederate defenders at 6:30 a.m. It took him over 2 hours to cross Tilghman Branch and swing his division into line on the north end of Jones Field. Pond's brigade and Ketchum's battery performed a well-conducted withdrawal before Wallace's men could bring them to battle. Ketchum held the front line, while Pond's infantry traversed the landscape to join the rest of the Confederate Army. Wallace paused at the north end of the field because the divisions of William T. Sherman, Stephen Hurlbut, and John McClernand hadn't moved and secured his left flank. Buell on the far left of the Union line was also moving slowly south, but it was mostly due to the terrain and the muddy mess created by the rain. Buell's troops moved out from Pittsburg Landing and crossed the Dill Branch Ravine. His entire force was finally in position around 9 a.m. As his men went through the former day's bloody fields, they found W.H.L. Wallace still alive. He was rushed to the rear where his wife was overjoyed to find her husband still among the living, and reports about his death being false. Buell's troops had encountered a few skirmishers from Forrest's cavalry, but no heavy resistance. The two Union wings were exposed out in the open ground without their center. Finally, Sherman, Hurlbut, and McClernand moved out. It was 10 a.m. before the entire Union Army had formed a stable line to confront the enemy. The Confederate line was a jumbled mess. One contemporary wrote the Confederate line resembled a shuffled pack of cards in which none adjoins its next in suit except by chance. Beauregard attempted to place troops in anticipation of Grant's move south, and Confederate soldiers came from all over the battlefield to form their lines. One Kentucky soldier named John Caldwell was looking over the wounded and dead when he was ordered to fall in. The following is his account. But before I go, I must look upon the faces of my noble dead. I have seen them again. The flaxen hair of little Tom Caldwell is matted over his once sunny face. Poor Land's face is so blackened by wound and forehead that I would not have known him but for wound and dress. Chestnut is calm as if sleeping. George Small's face is dark and lowering. The light of battle has faded from his face. My noble friend Casey appears to have been in great pain when he died. How I pity his family. Smith seems to have died easy. Johnson appeared calm. Tom Lyle suffered greatly, shot through the bowels. Walker suffered a good deal, but endured it like a man. Kennerly was in great misery, shot in bowel. John Pillow died last night. What a message I have for his family. Tell my mother I died like a soldier. Beauregard cobbled together a defensive line that was poorly prepared, but they would show resilience in the coming fight. One of the hardest fighting units on the Confederate side on the first day would also be one of the first units to see action on the second day. James Chalmers on the far right flank of the Confederate army formed up his men and readied them to defend themselves. However, he knew that his flanks would be in the air. He encountered William Bull Nelson's division crashing over the landscape. The rest of that flank was wholly unprepared. Jones Withers and others were preparing to march to the west to find their divisions and corps, but when they heard heavy fighting to the east, they countermanded their previous orders. Chalmers held the blue troops at bay until the other units could get formed. Benjamin Cheatham's brigades had marched all the way back to their bivouac location of April 5th, but were hurriedly on their way to the front. Those brigades came online as the Union troops pressed forward. Chalmers fell back and formed the extreme right flank of the Confederate army. Southern artillery placed on the outskirts of the Bell Cotton Field harassed the troops of Colonel Sanders Bruce. The artillery fired such effective volleys that Nelson sent a request to Buell for artillery support. In the quick movement to arrive at Pittsburg Landing, many artillery batteries had been left behind, but Buell secured him 2 batteries to duel with their Confederate counterparts. All the while the battle raged on the Confederate right. Beauregard was attempting to reclaim the success from the previous day. He wanted John C. Breckinridge to lead an attack in the center and drive back the approaching Federals. Likewise, he wanted the wings to move up in support. He informed William Hardee, the now commander of the right wing, even though many of his units were on the left flank, to move up and support Breckinridge. The brigade commanders got their orders and moved forward. It became the impression from couriers that the troops were not to fire because Breckinridge would be in their way. As they approached the tree line in the field, the blue troops waited until the rebels got nearly within point-blank range and delivered a devastating volley into the gray troops. This stunned the men and the commanders, sending many of the regiments to the safety of the trees. Numerous assaults would be made against the Union line, but eventually the Confederate right flank settled down in a defensive position. The Battle of Shiloh was turned into a stalemate, with neither side able to dislodge the other. Chalmers saw an opening to hit Amon's flank and hopefully turn the tide of the battle. He grabbed the flag of the 9th Mississippi and called for his brigade to follow him. They charged and smashed into Amon's flank, pushing back the blue troops and forcing them to divert their attention away from the Confederates in their front. Chalmers hammered Amon's line repeatedly. Buell found a few regiments to send to Amon's aid. The 2nd Iowa, 19th Ohio, and 40th Illinois rushed to the flank and halted the Confederates in their tracks. William Bull Nelson ordered his brigades to advance toward the rebel line. Bruce's brigade took some of the heaviest casualties attempting to cross the field. Gallantly, they attacked the Confederates, and it broke out into hand-to-hand fighting in some portions of the line, especially when the rebels launched their own counterattack. A captain in the 2nd Kentucky described the fighting and his wounding. The shock of a musket ball striking one in the hip has about the same feeling as if a person is struck with a blunt instrument or club, and produces a paralyzing sensation. He at first thought someone had hit him with a musket, and for an instant was rather angry at an imaginary assailant. but remembering that I had called out to a man in gray uniform, who was pointing his gun toward me to drop his piece, as well as feeling warm blood running down my leg, soon convinced me that the Confederate soldier had not obeyed my order as promptly as I know my own men would have done. He later wrote, "My only fear for myself was that I would bleed to death, but by the use of a silk handkerchief, I stopped the outside flow of blood by pushing the soft silk cloth into the entrance and exit of the bullet." Some of the Federal units retreated to the north end of the field. Those two battle lines stared at one another. To venture across the field was suicide. On Nelson's right, Hazen ran into a problem not experienced by Amon and Bruce. The left two brigades had to advance somewhat southward to hit the enemy, but Hazen had to turn to the southwest, exposing his flank. His men were fighting over the wheat field that had caught fire the day before, and the position of his troops made them succumb to flanking fire. Bruce sent the 20th and 1st Kentucky Regiments to Hazen's aid. Hazen sought to break the enemy line, and when William Smith's brigade came up on his right, he believed he had the power to do just that. As he readied his men, a private asked an officer to take what money he had on him to send to his family in the event of his death. The officer told him that he had just as much opportunity to die in this charge as the private, and instructed him to give it to the surgeon. Hazen ordered his men forward. Within minutes, that same private was shot through the forehead. Smith and Hazen's brigade ran into one another, not being properly coordinated. Smith also had the 14th Wisconsin of Grant's army now in tow. The Badgers had encamped near Smith's brigade, and without orders, joined the advance of Buell's army. The blue line busted through the Confederates, capturing a segment of the Washington artillery. One Ohio regiment lost 4 color bearers in that charge. The Confederates held on for dear life until Bowen's reformed brigade and elements of Stewart's brigade counterattacked. It was enough to drive off the Federals. As the retreating blue troops made it to the wooded areas and relative safety from the rebel bullets, they reformed. The Southerners pursued, led partially by General Hardee himself, who sustained a slight wound in the arm. Aside from this scrape, his jacket was riddled with bullet holes. They got hit in front and flank by the reformed blue soldiers, who weren't given up without a fight, and pushed back the rebels. It was a near stalemate on the Union left, a horrible back and forth with neither side gaining an inch. However, the Confederate center, commanded by John C. Breckinridge, was in the process of making their own assault.